In this video, I'm going to go through phase and time alignment. So the first thing, what is phase? Well, there are two types of phase that can occur within a recording. The first one being acoustic phase. This is where the distance of two mics will cause certain frequencies to cancel one another out. This result will mean that you'll have a weaker sound. And the second type of phase is electronic phase. And this could be the result of a cable and wiring that is been done incorrectly, like an XLR or a speaker cable. So let's look at acoustic phase. Acoustic phase is essentially a time and distance factor that can affect the sound of audio, particularly when there are more than two microphones being used to capture the source of the instrument. A typical example of this would be drums, as there are usually an array of close mics and distant mics involved to capture the kit. So basic principles of then phasing, if I use the sine wave here, if we look at it on the screen, you'll see that, think of it like a circle, that there's a 360 degrees of the phase cycle. So you've got 180 degrees at the top, and then from 180 to 360 at the bottom. And then anywhere in between, there can be a phase shift as to where that happens. Now, using the sine wave in its purest form, I've got a quick piece of audio there. And when they are playing together at the same time, and the sine wave moves up and down together, as shown here, so they move up and down together in the same time, the result of this means that you'll get a reinforcement of the sound. So it will sound twice as loud, which is why when you start getting into recording, it's never a great idea to copy and paste a track and have it as a double track instrument. That doesn't really work because they are perfectly in alignment. All the inflections of that performance are exactly the same. All you're doing is making that sound louder. So what happens if I actually play this sine wave here? Okay, so you can hear there, I think it's a 65 hertz cycle. It's nice and big and boomy. Now, I can actually adjust the phase electronically. So if I bring up the mixer here and use the trim control, this here is the polarity switch. Now, what I'm going to do is flip the polarity of the wave, and you can do this on the console as well, but I'm going to do it here electronically. Now, what I'm going to do is flip it so that it's 180 degrees. So now I've actually started this file and this one here, sorry. Essentially, this is going to start on the down and then go up. So they are now completely polar opposite to one another. And the result of this means that they will pretty much null each other out because they cancel. Now, the reason why you hear a very weak signal is that these aren't perfectly in alignment. There is a slight discrepancy at sample level as to where they are, which is why you can hear it. But fundamentally, they have cancelled out one another. So that's how you can do it. One way is using this polarity reverse. And again, that is found on the console, so you can check your phase there. Another way of doing this as well is actually moving the audio. So if I'm going to just check and to make sure I did turn that off. So they're now back in perfect phase. I can actually move the audio itself. So I'm going to slip it, and I'm going to try and do it so that they are now moved physically. And the result of this will be that it's a lot quieter. I could actually probably zoom in and see if I can get that actually more accurate. So find out where they cross over. So looking here, I could actually just bring this one along a bit more. Take it back to the beginning, and then theoretically it should be quieter again. There we go. And there would be a point theoretically when I get that correct that there won't be any sound whatsoever. But that's operating at sine wave level. That's not real world level. So what I have got here as well is a drum kit. And I can bring up and play what's going on. So here I've got a kit that's been recorded. We've got essentially two bass drum mics. One is at the front on the batter head. You've got one at the front of the kick drum. You've got a snare top, a snare bottom. You've got the toms, which are close mic'd. You've got overhead snare, overhead ride, and then there's an overhead sort of drummer. And then you've got some ambient room mics. So one's on the ride side and the other is on the snare. It's important when you're listening to phase to actually keep them in essentially mono and in the center at this point, so you can hear if there's any cancellation out between them. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to solo the bass drum, and I'm going to see and try and demonstrate the difference in terms of the tonality. So if I press, I'll just bring up I've got the EQ here as well, because EQ is another source of phase. Essentially, we are manipulating the phase of the drum in this instance, and that can also have an impact. But first of all, what we are going to do is check the phase relationship between the two mics, and you'll notice that on the EQ there is a phase or polarity switch here as well. So this is just the bass drum. I'm going to switch. You can hear there's a shift. Now here, you have to make a conscious decision, partly which sounds better, and which sounds like it's got more depth to it, and which sounds flatter. So there is a tonality difference. So we'll go back to the beginning and hit play again and listen to the tone of the bass drum. See, there are certain things when you flip the polarity of the bass drum, whereby you bring out some of the more some of the frequencies where they've reinforced one another. It doesn't necessarily sound as nice at this point. However, if you listen to the bass drum, there are certain things that when you put the out of phase, it has a depth to it, a much deeper sound, and it's brought out some of those overtones. And we can remove some of those things that we're hearing, and we can have the opportunity to do it. However, it's not wrong to listen to it like this. I mean, that's not unusable. It's just a case on this point, it's preference as to whether you want to use that as it is and think that's okay, and then sculpt out the sound with the phase as you manipulate the EQ there. So, I mean, usually as a sort of guide, sort of round about the 400 hertz mark is usually where it sounds a bit muddy. So I'm going to bring up this one, just sort of identify that. So right about there, it usually sounds a bit boxy. And do the same on this one. And then I flip the phase again. There's just a little bit more weight in the low end. I'm listening to that kind of oomph behind the bass drum. However, that's something you can play with and choose there. The other one, which will be more obvious as well, is the snare. Okay, this one's going to be much more obvious because we've got one on the top and one on the bottom. So I'm going to bring up the EQ again on this and demonstrate. So here with the phase, because this has been tracked and it's been checked already, when I turn the polarity on, listen to the snare and the depth of it. There's a loss of depth of the snare. It sounds a lot thinner than it is. Bear in mind, the snare drum is about 6.5 inches deep, okay, that all of a sudden sounds like it's a thin piece of paper being hit almost. So if I play that again, phase, phase. So you can hear really how much that has made an impact as well. So checking the phase on that snare. So that has been recorded correctly in the first place, because when I switch that in, it then weakens the depth, and there seems to be a loss of that lower mid kind of depth and body to it. You've also got the overheads to then consider as well. So we can bring in the overheads, and this one will take a bit more playing with, especially because we want to work it with the bass drum, because there is a phase relationship between all of these. So I'm just going to shift click on all of these so I can bring up all these EQs so I can change them and check them out. So here we go. So on the overhead snare, there's not a huge change in that. So the phase, no matter where we flip that, it's the same. It's not changed that too much. Let's do the same now with the overhead ride. There's a little bit more low end. Changing that, if you listen to the very low end of the bass drum, there's a change there, and it just has a little bit more weight. Again, not hugely negligible in terms of the difference, but there is a change. And there's even more of a change where I've changed the polarity of this one and then changed the polarity on the ride now. There's a definite difference that I can hear. So listening back again. So without, with. All of a sudden there's that big boom on the bass drum. And then let's just check the one over the head of the drummer. So. Now with this one, it changed the tail of the bass drum. When I changed the polarity, it shortened the bass drum length. It didn't allow it to envelope and bloom. It almost stunted it, almost like a gate. If you listen to it again, and then phase. So that relationship between the mics, between the bass drum and the overheads play a big part. And then if I was to bring in then the room mics that are associated around the kit as well, just bring those in. I'm just going to pull up those two EQs into it. So I'm going to start off with then the ambient ride. Straight away, there's a massive difference between that, and again, this one almost gated the tail of the bass drum and took away some of that bottom end and body. If we do it with the other one, again, straight away. So playing with the phase of the drums before you even do an EQ, you're kind of EQing it straight away, and it's better to be able to remove some of the over the top sound by using the EQ than it is to try and put something in that's not there. So that's looking at the drums. Now I also was talking about the electronic phase as well, and a cable. Now essentially, if I bring up the diagram of what an XLR cable is, you may not know that an XLR cable actually is wired out of phase within itself, so that you've got one side of it, the cable going, which we call inverting, and the other side of the cable we call non-inverting. And the reason for this is so that we can remove, it rejects any unwanted interference as the signal travels along the cable. And then the clever thing is that when you plug it in at the other end, so a preamp or whatever, the preamp itself will flip the polarity of the two cables back together to make some signal and remove any of that background noise. So it's a really clever cable. That's why XLRs are used for longer runs and stuff. Because they're shielded, but also the way the core is done with the two cables. One's essentially they're wired sort of out of phase on purpose within themselves to remove any unwanted noise. And again, that can be an electronic issue as well. That if they are wired differently, so if you've got the two on a bass drum, for example, that can alter the sound and the signal as well. The other ways of checking your phase as well is the 3-to-1 method. So the distance of an instrument, okay, of one mic to the instrument, and whatever that distance is. So for example, an acoustic guitar, if the microphone is 6 inches away from the acoustic, then the distance between the two mics must be about 18 inches apart between them in order to have some sort of a semblance of phase coherency. In addition to that as well, using DI. If you're using a microphone and a DI, the signal of the DI will obviously travel to the recording medium faster than the mic sound, because obviously there's a distance, and usually if you're miking something, then there's that process of physically moving the air before it gets to the diaphragm of the microphone being converted. There's a time discrepancy there. So again, that may need checking as well and seeing whether you need to align it. And that can also be done, as I said, just as a recap, you can also do it either electronically using the phase polarity switch, or in Pro Tools, as I've demonstrated here, you can time align your audio to match, to make sure. It's something that I don't necessarily do. I mean, we can see here where the bass drum is here. Oh, there's the front of the batter head, and then this is the batter head itself on, and you can see that they are slightly differing, but when you put them in the mix together, you then hear, all the kind of phase and the sound, how it comes to life. Usually what some engineers and producers will do is match these up to the overheads and time align the overhead, the bass drum and stuff, with the overhead of the drums, in order to make them phase aligned. I personally don't subscribe to that. I quite like the natural play between the mics themselves. You get the room then as well, a natural ambience and what's going on. Anyway, so that's phasing, and it's worth having a look, play with the drums. The drums are available for you to mess around with and try it and see how you get on.